Psychological horror in video games isn't just something you see, it's something you feel. It creeps under your skin, lingers in the back of your mind, and stays with you long after you've set the controller down. But why? What makes these games so uniquely unsettling? And what if I told you the answer lies in psychology? Not in surface-level jump scares, but in the deeper, foundational principles of human fear. In this video, we're going to explore the psychological underpinnings of horror in games through three distinct lenses: Kristeva's concept of the abject, Burke's notion of the sublime, and Jung's idea of the shadow. Each of these theories offer a unique way of understanding how horror games don't just scare us, they immerse us. By the end, we'll uncover how they use mechanics, narrative, and design to create experiences that are as thought-provoking as they are terrifying. To be abject is to have sunk to an existing low, showing hopelessness or severity in a bad situation made worse. Kristeva's concept of the abject speaks to the moments when the boundary between self and other collapses, or when the familiar becomes grotesquely alien. To the average person, it's when a sense of revulsion creeps up inside of you. Kristeva highlights food loathing as being the most elementary form of objection. I remember once watching a video essay on the topic of objection, and the creator used soured milk as an example. For instance, you're sitting in a room, and across the way, you spot a glass of soured milk. It's begun to have a thin layer of skin settle at the top, and that realization revulses you. It's disgusting. Something other. But to the average person, what does it mean to be other? Imagine, for instance, waking up as the character Gregor Samsa in Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis, and discovering that your body has become something different, something monstrous. Your family no longer sees you as part of the pack, and slowly but surely, that little bit of humanity left begins to fade away. The horror is not just in the transformation, but in the reaction of others, the isolation and the loss of self. Here, in a liminal space, the idea of not quite being human or monster, we're reminded of our own weaknesses. Mortality, disease, and decay are all elements of Kristeva's concept of the abject. In video games, Dead Space taps into this sense of objection through Isaac Clarke's journey aboard the USG Ishimura, where malformed creatures known as the necromorphs twist the human form into something foreign and disgusting. As a character, Isaac is constantly being subjected to situations that would mentally break the average person. Take, for instance, the scene where Isaac walks up to the glass window and gets forced to watch someone writhe on the floor in agony, wheezing as their lungs have been reversed and are on the outside of their body. The creature gasps and sputters, and as he looks in horror, not long after, it explodes into a viscera on the walls. The necromorphs undoubtedly play one of the most important roles in the identity of Dead Space, and it was by no means a mistake. An interview from Games Radar with Ben Wanat found that the necromorphs were actually conceived relatively early in the game's life. Wanat wanted the enemies to feel relatable. The production team deeply believed that aliens in games often felt too other, away from humans and encountering them. Therefore, they lost any sense of real threat or weight. In the intentional design of making them human, the user feels more connected to the experience, making the anxiety and fear that the player feels more real. The development team at Visceral Games, or EA Redwood Shores, designed Dead Space with the specific intent of immersing players in a visceral horror experience that would distinguish it from other titles in the genre. The dismemberment mechanic in Dead Space completely revolutionized how designers create systems for horror games. Unlike Resident Evil or traditional shooters, where a headshot means the end, players had to methodically sever the limbs of the necromorphs to defeat them effectively. This approach, ironically known as strategic dismemberment, was a deliberate deviation from genre norms, compelling players to adopt a more tactical and unsettling combat style. The design choice of forcing the player to dismember their enemy leans into the abject by not only physically killing the thing in front of them, but also by dismantling the very essence of its humanity it left. By forcing players to confront the fragility of this human-matched creature, they not only feel disgusted by the death of the beast, but by their own actions. Additionally, in this situation, combat cannot be taken lightly in the game, as it has some of the most graphic and disturbing game over screens even to this date. Sometimes, enemy designs within the game are taken to a bordered extreme. Actions that are otherwise ordinary or the core essence of humanity are normally what the developers focus on perverting in their design. Breathing, strength, life, and death all become twisted motifs within the narrative. The pregnant necromorphs in Dead Space exemplify this distortion, carrying writhing masses within their swollen bodies. This imagery is a twisted reflection of pregnancy, turning the promise of a new life into something revolting. It evokes the primal horror of the body's vulnerability, an idea often explored in feminist literature. In the case of Dead Space, the self in Abjection is pregnancy, a nurturing, life-giving process with the other that emerges as something grotesque. This is not an uncommon theme in horror or media. Ronald Cruz, author of the article Mutations and Metamorphosis, Body Horror is Biological Horror, states the horror of the uncertainty of the health or inhumanity of offspring is a real biological concern and has also been depicted in many films in the genre. We are who we are because of our genes, and that genetic makeup is beyond our control. Also beyond our control are mutations, which are random and unpredictable, monstrous, feminine. Beyond him, authors like Margaret Atwood and Mary Shelley, or even the original Alien, have depicted the act of pregnancy as invasive and transformative. This theme of pregnancy as horror taps into the innate fear of losing control over one's body. The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood portrays forced pregnancy as a means of control and dehumanization. Similarly, in Ridley Scott's Alien, the infamous chestburster scene depicts pregnancy in a parasitic way as well. Imagine an unwanted creature growing inside of you, draining your life force. There's a different fear in other cases where the baby is desired, the fear of growing a monster that will eventually consume you and commit violent acts. This fear highlights the loss of agency, a feeling most men wouldn't fully be able to empathize with. In many of these examples, pregnancy is transformed into a vehicle for exploring anxieties around bodily autonomy and vulnerability. Despite the use of these tropes, the horror of Dead Space surpasses its repugnant imagery, embedding itself in the game's very mechanics and environments. Beyond its central themes and character design and some of the team's design decisions, Dead Space excels in its game design choices. The setting of the USG Ishimura is a labyrinthian decaying vessel, but beyond that, a character. It breathes, it creaks, and it almost feels alive. A decaying structure that seems to conspire against Isaac at every turn. The development team honed in on environmental storytelling, using the ship's decayed and claustrophobic corridors to create a haunting atmosphere. Sound design also played a pivotal role, with ambient noises and eerie silences amplifying this tension and keeping players on edge. It's as if the ship itself is abject, something once functional, now a decaying malignant presence. The tension in this completely immerses the player within the setting by using diegetic sound and UI. Diegesis in horror is no easy task, but Dead Space delivered a design masterclass. Isaac's health and stamina were seamlessly integrated into his suit, while ammunition counts were displayed directly above his gun reticle, allowing the player to remain fully immersed in the experience. Resource management also plays a critical role in enhancing the sense of vulnerability. Ammunition and health are scarce, making every shot count, amplifying the anxiety of each encounter. This scarcity ensured that every decision carries weight. Each engagement becomes a tense struggle, and players have to think strategically about when to engage enemies and how to conserve their supplies. The player is now not just battling necromorphs, they're also contending with their dwindling resources and the fear of running out of them. The team recording multiple instances of Isaac's voice lines depending on his health or specific conditions he's in also amplifies the tension he feels, and in turn, the player. Through the use of strategic dismemberment, visceral enemy design, and an immersive environment, Visceral Games crafted a horror experience that forced players to confront their own fragility and discomfort, an abject feeling. The abject is not merely a visual element, but a psychological experience that taps into our primal fears of bodily transformation, loss of autonomy, and the thin boundary between the human and the monstrous. Because of this, Dead Space achieves its chilling atmosphere through graphic horror and by complicating players in the grotesque acts required to survive, challenging them to examine their actions and emotional responses. Much like Isaac's, the player's journey becomes one of wrestling with abjection, where the self blurs with the other, and where survival demands a reckoning with the dark, twisted, and uncanny. be sublime is something that inspires awe, usually because of elevated quality. When one thinks of beauty in an object, they may often look for small characteristics. Elegance can usually be described as something that brings a sense of peace, frequently perceived as delicate or graceful. Beauty, however, would be defined in a way that brings charm or delight to an object. The tiny, fragile porcelain dancer sitting atop a shelf, or perhaps someone you glance at from across the way. Both words are characteristics that are required of the sublime. Something can't just be beautiful, elegant, or wonderful. It must go beyond these expectations to create something that can't quite just be described with pleasant words. Edmund Burke's concept of the sublime challenges the traditional sense of emotions we feel when we think of what it means to experience the heightened senses or the feeling of something sublime, when we see something more than what could just be described. Burke thinks that the sublime centers on experiences that evoke reverence, terror, and a sense of overwhelming vastness or power. While heavy rainfall could be perceived as something peaceful, a major storm's raw destructive force is much greater than ours. According to Burke, the sublime is tied to the feelings of fear and astonishment, often triggered by nature's grandeur or the unknown. It describes an aesthetic experience that overwhelms the senses, blending pleasure with dread, and is frequently rooted in the perception of danger or pain. When isolated from real events, the experience feels overpowering and insurmountable. But how can it be captured when the context of games comes to mind? Nature is a common setting in horror games. The forest, Alan Wake, and Slender the Eight Pages immediately come to mind. The feeling of being stuck alone in a space that, while not inherently threatening, fills you with dread. One step further could leave you lost in its ever-growing, almost omnipresent space. The strongest elements of the sublime are best characterized by the game Darkwood. Darkwood, by Acid Wizard, is a top-down horror survival game that plunges players into an eerie, semi-procedurally generated forest filled with strange creatures, limited resources, and an anxiety-inducing atmosphere. When examining Darkwood, it becomes clear that the game utilizes similar principles, particularly in how it invokes the sublime. At its core is a survival horror game that excels in creating atmosphere of dread through both its narrative and the use of restricting player information. Instead of relying on traditional horror game mechanics, the game uniquely builds tension by restricting the player's vision of the character to a small radial circle and a controlled cone. This also leans into a non-diegetic sixth sense of the player's surroundings, in which a monochrome color palette represents the player's view, but the character's view is in color. This choice always gives the player access to what the general area beyond their sight looks like, which in turn also creates some very interesting gameplay moments where places look one way to the player, but completely different to the character. This dual perspective, how the player perceives the game world versus the character's perception, introduces two key concepts of horror: the horror of participation and the horror of transportation. The horror of participation refers to the fear that is amplified through the player's active involvement and the direct consequences of their actions. Meanwhile, the horror of transportation involves psychological immersion, where the player feels emotionally manipulated and drawn into the game's eerie narrative. In Darkwood, both types of horror are used to craft an unsettling experience that keeps the player on edge. Another tactic it uses to amplify this is by creating deliberate lulls in the player's engagement. This can also be recontextualized as the horror of participation. These lulls occur during the moments where the player's active control feels limited, such as the silence during a mundane walk to collect gas for the next night, or the subtle suggestion that something immense and dangerous lurks just out of sight. By restricting the player's control over their environment, the game fosters an ever-present sense of vulnerability, effectively both leaning into the concept of the sublime and generating the horror of participation by emphasizing the player's anxiety about what could happen next. At the same time, Darkwood employs elements of the horror of transportation through its atmosphere and environmental storytelling. The dark, oppressive visuals combined with the haunting soundscapes psychologically transport the player into the forest. The player becomes immersed in a world that feels alien and threatening, fostering an emotional connection that is akin to being lost in an actual nightmare. By blurring the lines between what the character experiences and how the player perceives those experiences, it creates an effective blend of horror of participation and horror of transportation, making the horror feel both immediate and deeply psychological. The game also skillfully employs both diegetic and non-diegetic sound to immerse players in the intensity of the atmosphere. Foley, such as the subtle creaking of floorboards or the distant growl of an unseen creature, ground the players in their environment, making them acutely aware of their surroundings. These sounds create a sense of place, reminding the players that not only are they alone in the woods, but that the environment also poses a constant threat. In contrast, the often dreamlike, low rumble of the score creates a strong sense of almost primal anxiety during the night. The use of natural sounds like the wind returns the player to a place of fear that they can't quite put their finger on. But when dawn finally arrives, the sudden crescendo that shifts to a softer, warmer score allows the player to have a breath of fresh air and comes as a welcome relief. As designers, we often strive to engage players through meaningful interaction, and horror games achieve this by placing players in direct control of their survival. Decisions such as what upgrades for them to take, when to venture away from home, and how to manage the limited resources directly affect the outcome, creating a strong sense of active participation. Players feel both empowered by their agency and overwhelmed by the vast, unpredictable dangers surrounding them. By making them constantly aware of their actions, emergent experiences can easily occur. Whether barricading themselves in for the night, or confronting one of the many eldritch horrors within the setting, all actions have direct consequences. This level of interaction heightens tension and fear, reinforcing the sense of both being in control and vulnerable within the game's often unforgiving world. Darkwood, because of this, stands as a prime example of how a horror game can leverage both psychological and participatory elements to invoke fear, awe, and the sublime. By blending Burke's concept of the sublime with the horror of participation and transportation, along with employing sophisticated sound design, Darkwood creates an atmosphere that is both deeply immersive and profoundly unsettling. It captures the delicate balance between agency and vulnerability, inviting players to confront their fears while challenging their perception of control. This combination of thematic depth, atmosphere, and player-driven experiences makes Darkwood a powerful and unique entry in the horror genre. Carl Jung's concept of the shadow delves into the dark, unknown side of the human psyche. It is the repository for aspects of ourselves that we deny, reject, or fail to integrate. As Jung puts it, this shadow is the sinister and frightful brother, our own flesh and blood counterpart. The shadow concept is explored through literature, psychology, and interactive media like video games. Mouthwashing, released in 2024 by the studio Wrong Organ, is a psychological horror game that leans less on a unique gameplay hook, but feeds more into the ludonarrative and games as a storytelling medium. It masterfully intertwines Jung's ideas about the shadow with a distinct narrative and ludonarrative design, creating an experience centered on repression, projection, and the darkness lurking beneath human nature. In Jung's work, the shadow often represents the embodiment of a person's unwanted qualities, the parts they cannot acknowledge and seek to repress. It's described as the psychic shadow side present within every individual. A paper released by Connolly in 2003 expands on this by emphasizing the difficulty of accepting the other within oneself. When we deny the validity of others, we deny the shadow's right to exist, both within ourselves and in our environment. This denial of our internal darkness stifles our capacity for empathy and authentic interaction. Set on the Tulpar, a cargo freighter in a dystopian future, The story of Mouthwashing begins with an unknown individual whom we later find out is Jimmy, sabotaging the autopilot so the ship drifts off into an asteroid's path. Curly, the captain of the ship, stops the vessel from complete destruction at the expense of being brutally disfigured and disabled. The story alternates between two time periods with two different characters. One uses flashbacks to show Curly's earlier attempts at maintaining morale, including his discovery that the Pony Express will soon replace the entire human crew with automation. The other focuses on the aftermath of the crash, when Jimmy becomes the acting leader, while Anya, Swansea, and Daisuke struggle to survive. Before the crash, Curly appears restrained but well-meaning, as he manages the tensions caused by the exploitative corporate policies and personal anxieties of the team. Meanwhile, Jimmy resents Curly's leadership despite having gained his position thanks to Curly's recommendation. Anya confides in her pregnancy, Swansea bickers with the naive Daisuke, and everyone dreads losing their jobs after this voyage. When Curly announces the layoffs during what should be a celebratory speech, bitterness and hostilities intensify, especially in Jimmy, whose envy and insecurities drive the story within the game. Mouthwashing is a prime example of the show-don't-tell principle within game design, tackling and critiquing many themes. Corporate capitalism, failed ambition, and sexual abuse are only a few to name. When analyzing the metagame in Mouthwashing, it chooses to lean away from traditional gameplay hooks and instead hones in on its character study to create a dynamic for the player centered on deduction, narrative interpretation, and morality. This approach allows players to piece together the truth about why the crew is in such a bad state, deepening their engagement within the story. The quote at the beginning of the section highlights a conversation between Curly and Anya, where they discuss the nighttime view from the ship and a dead pixel on the window screen. It's seemingly a mundane conversation that reflects the core themes of Mouthwashing, the unnoticed flaws that remain hidden in plain sight. Anya mentions, "If you look really close, you can see a dead pixel in the upper right corner. This dead pixel becomes a symbol of the imperfections no one wants to acknowledge but can't ignore. From the Jungian perspective, it stands for the shadow itself, an unacknowledged flaw that subtly affects the entire picture." Curly's response, focusing on the bigger picture, represents a coping mechanism that seeks to avoid confronting imperfections that may threaten the sense of normalcy. Through this, the narrative of repression and projection is masterfully explored within the Loda narrative, intersecting both the game's narrative and its mechanics. The game uses repetition as a motif, with phrases like "I hope this hurts" and "take responsibility" serving as echoes of the unresolved emotions that the characters suppress. The idea of kills 99.9% is center stage, referring to both Mouthwash and the game's constant references to the ship's crash, implying no amount of sanitizing can erase the lingering guilt or remove the 0.1% of worst offenders. Character relationships in Mouthwashing showcase the psychological dynamics central to the game's theme of repression. The protagonist Curly represents a subdued figure, constantly belittled by Jimmy, while Jimmy projects his insecurities onto Curly and manipulates him constantly. Curly attempts to remain loyal, repressing his potential resentment or blind hopefulness in Jimmy's character, and turns himself into a complete pushover. This dynamic, seen through the gameplay and dialogue, leads to the eventual psychological breakdown near the game's climax. Curly, who remains mostly silent throughout the story, finally breaks down into hysterics after Anya's suicide. In true Jungian fashion, the act of not confronting his own shadow, of not admitting his true feelings towards Jimmy, causes an eruption of uncontrollable emotions. Jimmy is the embodiment of the game's shadow, looming over everyone within the ship, manipulating and abusing others in ways that become obvious only after recontextualization. The player initially perceives Jimmy as a well-meaning if flawed character, but as the story unfolds, the game recontextualizes events, revealing him as the true monster. His attempts at mouthwashing as a symbolic gesture to cleanse himself of guilt illustrate the emptiness of his gestures. He seeks to wash away his crimes by controlling and ultimately killing the crew in a murder-suicide plot. His projection and inability to integrate with his darker side harm everyone aboard the ship. The themes are explored through environmental symbolism. For instance, the ship's window screen changes over the course of the game. It starts off with a blue sky, shifts to a sunset after the crash, then night with a dead pixel, and finally settles on the vibrant, harsh red glow. This transition visually reflects the journey of the characters and the state of the ship, from a bright, seemingly peaceful sky to a deep, blinding red. These changes mark the descent into chaos and the culmination of suppressed fears and guilt. There is a moment of dramatic irony 2 months after the crash where the crew, hungry, break into the storage bay to avoid starvation, and once finally cracking it open, they discover an infinite bound of mouthwash. The mouthwash, was dismissed by Anya as worthless because of its sugar content, not only foreshadowing Jimmy's torture of Daisuke before his final moments, but also alluding to the fact that they will die for a purposeless cause. At least it'll be safe enough for them to drink. Sometime after the crash, the story shifts to Jimmy in a much darker version of the Tulpar. Parts of the ship are cut off from insulation foam, resources are scarce, and Anya struggles to care for Curly, who is mute and immobile, while Swansea self-medicates by drinking Mouthwash. Daisuke's hope and eagerness to prove himself make him susceptible to manipulation by Jimmy. In this claustrophobic post-crash setting, each character's suppressed feelings slowly but catastrophically begin to emerge as the game moves into the climax. Jimmy, initially seen as flawed but not entirely malevolent, transforms into the hidden villain who secretly manipulates and threatens everyone here. After Anya finally breaks and locks herself in the medbay, Daisuke gets manipulated by Jimmy into climbing into the service vent to rescue Anya. Players should remember from earlier in the game that this vent was incredibly dangerous, and Daisuke becomes mortally wounded, triggering Swansea to snap and execute Daisuke in an act of mercy, which could also be a metaphor for how swans, when stressed, will kill their young. Jimmy, at this point, becomes aware of Anya's suicide, grabbing the pistol in an attempt to stop Swansea's rampage. They both clash, and at this point, it's not definitive at what happened, but Jimmy ends up coming out on top, finishing off Swansea. This ends with Curly's repressed anger towards Jimmy finally breaking out into hysteria after the climax of these events. Diving into the resolution of the game is a payoff powerful in its depiction of consequences of failing to confront the shadow. Curly's hysteria is powerful because it is the first time that he has to acknowledge the inevitable. Jimmy has finally become undeniable as his shadow figure, and the repression that held the crew together has unraveled completely. In the final moments, it becomes clear that Jimmy's insecurities and incompetence have doomed the entire crew. He is found seated at the table with their lifeless bodies, every one of them a casualty of his desperate attempts to evade blame. Despite the carnage, Jimmy clings on to a twisted notion of heroism by vowing to save them all. But even this promise is laced with self-importance rather than true remorse. When he carries Curly to the cryo chamber, declaring that he will become the villain for Curly's sake, it is less than an act of self-sacrifice than a final bid to control the narrative. By choosing how he appears, hero or villain, he sidesteps the deeper truth of his own failings. Ultimately, Jimmy's inability to accept any real responsibility exposes the unintentional yet very real architect of the tragedy. As he walks off screen, and the echoing bang punctuates the aftermath, the full weight of his actions settle over the scene. The saddest fact of the matter being that the crew is doomed to die the second Jimmy steered the ship off course, and Curly would never be found. The narrative design of Mouthwashing is strengthened by its use of speech that delineates the character's emotional states and relationships. The color-coded speech reflects dynamics. For instance, the color green is often associated with the feelings of disgust and envy, two core themes of Jimmy's character. An even lesser-known use of color is the board game with 4 pieces that move in accordance with the current plot of the story. The 5th piece is intentionally left off the board to signify Curly's lack of presence within the ship. This use of color helps create an emotional and psychological contrast that enhances the narrative. Beyond the motif of color, it's clear the team at Wrong Organ had strong inspiration on its themes from media outside of games, as the relationship between Jimmy and Curly mirrors the Aesop fable of the scorpion and the frog. Jimmy's inherent cruelty ultimately destroys those around him despite his claims of friendship and loyalty. The final theme I'll tackle in the game is the motif of eyes. Eyes are a prevalent symbol throughout the story, either representing Jimmy feeling like he's always being watched or judged by others, or potentially signifying his greater insecurity or inability to accept responsibility for his actions. Each character within the story has different eyes, either losing or keeping them. Daisuke, for instance, loses both of his in execution. Curly maintains only his right eye, constantly forced to keep it open. Swansea only has his left, and Anya retains both. The choice of eyes is entirely intentional as a form of visual symbolism. Daisuke's blindness is symbolic of his innocence and inability to see Jimmy for the manipulator he is, while Curly's forced vigilance reflects his struggle to face reality as he is forced to slowly watch the chaos Jimmy caused unfold. He must accept that Jimmy is a monster. Swansea's opposite loss of Curly is left more up to interpretation, potentially denoting that he was always suspicious of Jimmy and didn't trust him from the beginning, but at the same time did nothing to prevent him from enacting his plan. Anya, however, is left with both eyes because she's the only one on the ship that is entirely aware of the situation, and sees Jimmy as the cruel and selfish animal he truly is. Outside of the themes of the game, the subgenre Mouthwashing does not shy away from is psychosexual horror, embodied in Anya's experience aboard the ship. Anya's portrayal is a critique of both the male gaze and her manipulative tactics for survival. While she appears defenseless, acting in ways that seem incompetent to appease Jimmy's insecurities, she is in fact the most capable crew member. She keeps Curly alive, but her manipulation is her means of coping, a response to the fear instilled by Jimmy. The restraint of her true talents and the adaptation of a weaker persona is part of her survival strategy theme encoded in Jung's exploration of how individuals bury their true selves in response to external pressures. Ultimately, this careful self-effacement allows Anya to continue operating under Jimmy's radar, but it is only a temporary solution. As tensions within the story mount and resources dwindle, her hidden strengths can no longer shield her from the escalating conflict. The same protective facade that grants her a degree of safety also isolates her emotionally, leaving her with few outlets for anxiety and the despair that she feels. And in the end, the weight of her suppressed capabilities, her silent fears regarding her pregnancy, and Jimmy's ever-growing volatility resulted in not only her tragic suicide, but Jimmy managing to grab the gun that will result in Swansea's execution and Jimmy's eventual suicide as well. Ultimately, Mouthwashing excels at telling a story of repression and projection, and the failure to integrate the shadow. The ludonarrative, the intricate weaving of the gameplay, environmental storytelling, and character dynamics create a psychological portrait of characters who cannot confront their true nature. The journey from denial to horror reflects what happens when we fail to acknowledge and integrate our darker selves, offering a chilling reminder of Jung's warning that the more we attempt to meet our shadow, the more it grows beyond our control. Horror, in games like Dead Space, Darkwood, and Mouthwashing, take a sophisticated turn that moves beyond standard jump scares, leading players into a realm of psychological fear and uncertainty. Drawing on concepts such as Kristeva's Abject, Burke's Sublime, and Jung's Shadow, these games create powerful, atmospheric experiences that resonate deeply with their audiences. Both Dead Space and Darkwood revolve around a metagame rooted in limited resources and information, effectively building a high level of tension. Darkwood grants players more data, but compromises its reliability through a deliberately flawed map, evoking disorientation and a sense of loss. By contrast, Dead Space doubles down on combat and scarcity, amplifying the visceral horror and provoking disgust as players battle nightmarish creatures. Meanwhile, Mouthwashing diverges from these resource-driven strategies, instead centered on the complexities of its unreliable narrator, social dynamics, and symbolism. Here, the metagame was defined by deduction, narrative interpretation, and moral deliberation, pushing players to uncover the true villain. Ultimately, all of these games demonstrate horror's potential not only to entertain, but also to elicit profound psychological responses. Their seamless blend of fear, agency, and unknown offers meaningful insights into human vulnerability and our encounters with our darker selves. By creatively weaving psychological principles into game mechanics, storytelling, and environmental design, Dead Space, Darkwood, and Mouthwashing encourage players to engage both cognitively and emotionally, reaffirming horror's ability to delve into and illuminate the complexities of the human condition. I just want to thank all of you for watching. If I hadn't had the opportunity to listen to a wonderful Jacob Geller video essay, I don't think I actually ever would have initially found interest in the complexity and inner workings of the horror genre, or even the robust indie scene that's filled with a plethora of absolutely wonderful games by many talented creators. Perfect Vermin in particular was one of my first experiences to see the stories a game could tell beneath the surface level scares, and for that, I draw inspiration and I'm truly grateful. I also want to thank all of my wonderful friends within the program who've always pushed me to improve my character and grow as a person. Asad Ali, who's shown me that even those that start off as rivals can become best of friends. Brennan Lee Muhammad, Joya Bejo, and Sebastian Mena Andrade, who've always shown me how to struggle through my worst. I cannot thank all of you enough for helping me grow into the person that I've become as a professional, and to the many more that I don't have space to name. I'd also like to thank my professor Chris Crowell for reigniting not only my love for game development, but public speech as a whole. And finally, my beautiful girlfriend, who's always ensured that I remain well-fed and rested on my countless nights at work. If you like this content and want me to make more video essays, don't forget to like and subscribe. Have a great night, everyone. Thank you.